In this video, I would like to give you some principles of the human reading process. Actually, the reading process is not as continuous as it seems. Of course, we are somehow following the lines of characters in a text, but this does not happen continuously, but it happens with fixations and saccades. Saccades are the short, fast jumps between the fixations, and the fixations are the times when we keep our eye focus constant for approximately 250 to 400 milliseconds. The saccades, they follow approximately the lines and the line breaks. That is, we read through the text as the characters indicated. But during a fixation, we can only fixate approximately 5 characters sharply. That means if we have a very long word, this cannot be covered by one fixation alone, but we have a saccade in between. We have a jump of 2 different fixations. Let's watch how this happens. So you can see it here. It's German text which illustrates approximately where we fixate, and you see that all the rest is vague, is unclear to us. But still, if you are able to recognize the German language, you are able to understand the text by filling in the gaps between and by combining the information as you see it here. Now, this combination does not strictly happen left to right and top to down. It's an iterative process. That is, we have some jumps, forward jumps, but also backward jumps in the movements. These are called regressions. And these regressions are more frequent when the text gets more complicated. And this illustrates that we do an understanding process in parallel to the reading process. And if there's an understanding problem, we go back to the text and consult the text again in order to better understand what is meant by the text. So in human reading perception, there's actually not only a recognition, but also an understanding process happening. We'll come to the combination of recognition and understanding process when we explain the setup of technical systems which imitate this process.